online events. So that's all there for you. And again, we're almost at 6:30. So just a reminder for anyone else who's joined while I've been talking, that's the best place to get information. And if you are not already on our email distribution list, then you can send us an email here to info@a12gifted.org, and we would be happy to add you to that. All right, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I am going to go ahead and get started here. Let me close that out. And looks like we are already recording, so that's good. I didn't want to mess that up. All right, thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, I'm excited to be able to have this opportunity to have parents come on and answer some of their questions and get some more information about our twice exceptional learners. I know there's a lot of interest in this from parents, so hopefully this is helpful. Serena, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen whenever you want to, go for it.
Okay.
I'm going to ask that everyone stay muted, if you wouldn't mind. And if you have questions that while you're listening to the presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat. When we get to the question and answer portion, we're going to start with some of the questions that people have emailed and sent to me over the last, as they've been signing up. But then after that, if we have time, we'll try to get to all the questions in the chat. So go ahead and add those there.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I have to do, I'm sorry,
No,
for some reason it doesn't want to pull up. So let me, give me just a second. While I'm dealing with technical difficulties, I'll just introduce myself.
Okay. I can introduce you, but
what, you were going to introduce me?
I was, but you can go right.
Go
you can give
then.
yourself
if you'll do that so that
let
I
you
can
focus on your tech.
Yes, please.
All right. So we have joining us tonight, Serena Campos. I hope is that how you pronounce your last name?
It is.
Great. Serena has worked in public education for 30 years. She's been a classroom teacher, an instructional leader, and a school principal. She was recently the principal of the Highly Gifted Magnet Program in Denver Public Schools. And she's worked in a variety of different socioeconomic settings and different districts here in the state of Colorado. So she has plenty of experience working with all sorts of students and twice exceptional kids. She currently is working for the Colorado Department of Education as a twice exceptional consultant. And we're very happy to have her here to give us some information and answer some questions. We also have on the call Dr. Terry Lucera. I see you on there. Thank you for joining us. Terry is the founder and director of Peak Exceptional Services. That's a local provider of psychoeducational assessments for children of all ages. Terry is both a neuropsychologist, but also a parent to gifted and twice exceptional children herself. So she also has many years of experience dealing with all the complexities that come when you have gifted children that also have learning challenges. And then finally, I just want to mention that we have Lynn Saltzgaver also on the call. Lynn is our Director of Advanced Academic and Gifted Services for Adams 12. And so she can be here, maybe answer questions that are related to GT programming specifically in our district. And with that, it looks like Serena's got hers up. So take it away.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I know that as questions come up, those will go right into the chat. Just to make sure that we have enough time for questions, I think those are really important. I'm going to go through this presentation, and if there are things that you see that you would like more information on, reach out to Joanne and I'll make sure that I get her things that people might need. So I wanted to start out with just a little bit about who we are. Please know with the current state, getting current data has been tough. So I went with the most current that we currently have. But really just taking a look at an overview of how many of those kids in the state were identified as gifted. And then out of that percentile, how many are gifted and also 2E. And so the other piece that's just sort of interesting to look at is that 1,500 were gifted with an IEP, and 2,900 had a 504. So we're seeing a lot more families opt for a 504. And I think there are lots of reasons there, but as we begin to look through this, and as you think about this as a parent, you also want to be thinking about making sure that you have the right document to get the kinds of differentiation that your child needs. So the state of Colorado has a definition, and so basically it's those students who are identified as gifted according to state criteria, and identified with a disability and have an IEP or a 504. And I just listed a few. Please know this, the list on the side is not comprehensive, but it is some of the more common ones that we see in the state of Colorado. And so I think the big one is that sometimes people think it's just with an IEP, but as you can see, a lot more of our students have been identified with the 504. So here's the hard part, is that our 2E learners are at risk, and that's why things like tonight are so important. They often have poor behavior, which is honestly a result of their frustration, the low self-esteem that some of our children have. And it's often because they aren't performing as well as their brain is. And you know what this is like. We've all been there. And nights like tonight, where we began to talk about this and ask questions, this is why it's so important, because it's all about the heart of our children and making sure that we have the information we need to make sure that they aren't at risk. So these are some things that you'll hear and I think are common in education. Kids can't be gifted because they have an IEP, they're failing a class. My favorite, they can't memorize something. That is a fascinating aspect to all of this and to kids being gifted. Actually, a lot of them don't memorize things that are menial. And so that's why this makes me laugh a lot. Handwriting comes up quite a bit, as well as writing for a lot of our 2E students. Please know too, the other part of this is that our 2E kids are working super hard. And for some of them, that means they're scoring average. But imagine if they didn't have their disability, what they would be scoring. And so these are the pieces that are so critical. As we move forward, I'm hoping to give you guys just a few strategies and some characteristics of gifted as well as gifted with a disability or 504. So the ones that are bolded on this particular slide, I think, are really the ones that sort of seem to kind of pop out at you. Very highly inquiring minds, no repetition, asynchronous development. So brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And yet social emotionally, they're functioning 2 to 3 grade levels below. When I was a principal of a magnet school, an example I loved using with this is I had some third grade boys, and it was movie day, and they were in our highly gifted magnet, and they wanted to bring their lovies. And so that is a very classic example of our kids having some asynchronous development. So this slide is terrific, and I'm actually going to be quiet here for just a minute and let you look at the category with, there's some gifted characteristics and then gifted with disabilities. So take a few minutes. So I think the last one we see a lot, where if it's something of interest, they can concentrate like nobody's business. But if it's not something of, intense interest, they may not have very solid ability to, to attain to things. The other part of this is, as you're thinking about reading abilities, you'll hear kids have amazing vocabularies, however, have a difficult time decoding. And so just things to think about as you're thinking about a student who's trying to function in an everyday classroom situation. So as we move forward, I was asked to talk about some ways that parents can work with the schools as well as with their own children, ways to support. So I came up with 3 that I feel like are big, but also it's a starting place and can become and will become more complex, I feel like, as your child develops and moves through the school system. So the first one is collaborating with your student's school. There was a question around accountability and holding schools, making sure they're doing the things that they've said they're going to do. And this is, to me, where that comes in. I'm not so sure that it's accountability as much as it is collaborating to figure out how to best meet the needs of your student. And so it's pretty important. I'm going to talk to you about who should be at the table, and then just give you a few topics. The next one is just that paradoxical characteristics and dual differentiation. So lots of words. Really, it's about making sure that we're taking care of both their strengths and their weaknesses, and so that we're doing both all the time. And then the last part is really learning about your own child's learning styles, their passions, and their interests. And so you can see very different levels, but all pretty critical to a student becoming successful in a setting. So let's start with collaboration. This particular slide, as you can see at the bottom, really came out of just ways to support. And it really talks about stakeholder groups. The reason this list is unique is because our 2E students are unique. And often what will happen is you'll have a general teacher and maybe the special ed teacher. And then you might have another meeting with the general teacher and the gifted teacher. The real need here is to put all of those people in the same room. And the other people that you would want to add, if possible, would be the social emotional support in the building, whether that's a school psychologist or a social worker. And as a former principal, I would put the principal in the room and ask for that. And here's why. It is really difficult for teachers to collaborate together, and the principal is going to be the one to help you and them connect the dots. And that's really important. And it's important because that team getting together, even if it's just the principal in there once, having an understanding of all of the components of your child will just be really helpful, especially as frustrations surface or as needs arise. And so it's just a nice way to include the entire team. And this is just from my own background, but I used to love meeting before the school year started. So I would try to reach out to families a week or two before school started and sit down and just talk about what are some things that, we're coming up with this year, and who do we have to have at the table? And then that way, when school started, we kind of already had meetings in place. But it is a very nice way also just to hear from you and to hear about the summer and start to build that relationship. The questions on here, I think, are super great. It just really helps to frame some of those conversations. So topics. I put these up because I think sometimes you get in a room and you're not quite sure where to start. So these are great topics, and here's why. They are common with a lot of our 2Es. Please know this is not exhaustive. There are lots of others, but I felt like if you were in a place where you weren't quite sure where to start, one of these might speak to you as a result of, the needs of your child. And so what this does is it allows you to kind of go in with, I'd like to talk about this. I'm wondering what kind of information you might have, so that when we're meeting and we're trying to put some things in place for my child, that we have the data that we need and the people in the room, and so that we can begin to collaborate and work on this. I think the other piece that I didn't add on that other page, but I mean, it said family. That is going to be so critical for you creating relationships. Please know that it's not that schools are resistant as much as figuring out how to personalize life for 3, 4, 1,500, 2,000 kids. That's kind of what people are doing, and they change all year long. And so it's just so important for you to really kind of go in with the topic and have a way to communicate with people. I liked this because it does go to paradoxical characteristics that I referred to. And the reason that I like talking about this is that it helps teachers, especially when they go, oh, you're right. They have an amazing vocabulary, but they really don't like to write. And so it really helps them to begin to see why they're 2E. And that whole list of they can't be gifted because, this helps them to get the whole teeter-totter dynamic of who our children are. And it just frames some things in a very concrete way. My favorite part too is just often they can solve problems, and then how difficult it is for them to solve problems with their teams. They have this amazing ability to ask questions, but then they want to argue that they're right. And so I really love this for teachers, for parents, for us just to really think differently. It also, as educators, often validates that they knew there was something there, because it's like that light bulb goes off. Oh yeah, I'm seeing that. So really getting to the point of looking at this for your own student. And I recommend, as you think about paradoxical characteristics, that you do this for your own child, because it's really helpful for you to begin to think about this just in your own way. And more importantly, as your child gets older, the more they know about who they are, the more that they can put things in place for themselves and just get better and better at, sort of navigating, advocating for themselves, all of those things that we want. So when we look at dual differentiation, the reason that we're doing this is because it's really who our children are. So supporting their strengths and supporting their disabilities. So looking at ways to do strengths first. And here's the piece that's so important for us. As a school system, often we want to support just the disability, and we think if we can get the disability under control, then the strengths will come. The truth of the matter is, for our 2E children, their strengths are actually more important, because they have to know what their gifts are, and their gifts are what is going to help them want to actually address their disabilities. Because if they want to do something and they know they have to have accommodations, then they will figure out how to put those in place for themselves with support. But if they only focus on what they're not doing well, that's when we get behavior problems. That's when we get low self-esteem. And it's also when we lose our kids. So 2 things to keep in mind. So ways to challenge. The part that I love on this top slide is that time to work with intellectual peers. Sometimes you're going to have to put them in a totally different grade level or out of their learning environments and put them in environments that they're going to be challenged. And that's tricky. And again, that's why you have to collaborate with this team, because if they're willing to let your son or daughter go to the classroom or the learning environment for them to have access to this, then it's going to take some coordination. On the other side of that, really looking at how are we supporting the student's area of need. Now, the piece I want to mention here is this. What we need to do is use their strengths, right? Use their areas of giftedness to address some of their needs. For kids who potentially have social emotional needs, which honestly are quite a few. Why would we address social emotional needs in an environment that they're already struggling in, right? So let's just say they're amazing readers. Instead of working on social emotional pieces at lunch, why not work on social emotional pieces in their classroom during a Socratic seminar, right? So now they're in an area where they already have a strength, and now you're adding some goals for them to work on the things that they need to work on. So that's just a little bit of a shift when we think about who our kids are. Here are some other ways to look at this and to help support kids around learning styles, areas of growth, areas of interest, and also it allows our kids to have some things to kind of fall back on. I love Resident Expert. And this is also a great way to integrate some social skills, because if they are out helping other students or teachers, we had a highly gifted student who used to go around the classrooms before the day started and make sure that technology was working in classrooms. And so that was how we helped this particular student make eye contact, have interactions with everybody in the building, and wasn't an extra piece in the school day, but helped him again with some executive function pieces. He had to write down what classrooms he had been to. I mean, it really sort of, those are some ways that one, it was writing, social emotional. So you can see how we used his strength to help meet some of these other needs. Create a learning profile. A student study form, amazing. And getting online and looking at, you can Google learning profiles, and there's everything under the sun. So the more a student knows about who they are, the more that they are open to getting really their strengths met and their brains met, but also willing to think about why they're frustrated at different times and why behaviors sometimes flare. Okay, I know I went fairly quickly. I did want to end with this little note by Thomas Armstrong, and he has a book on neurodiversity, but I just think this, the quote, looks like a few T's got left out of there somewhere. So really just helping us to look at our students' strengths rather than their weaknesses, and allowing our students to really become who they were meant to be. And that, I think, is the name of the game. When I started out with heart, it's truly that, right? It is about how much we want our kids to grow and be who they are supposed to be. So, Joanne, with that, I want to kind of stop and turn it over.
That's great. Yeah, that quote at the end reminds me, the CAGT has had some great speakers, including some on TUI, and one of them, Julie Skolnick, has a talk that you can go and see on CAGT's website. They have them recorded where you can watch them for free. But she really talks a lot about that, focusing on the strengths and starting from there. So I think that's great. I want to ask quickly, the last slide before this, you said with the what did you call it, the study plan or the learning?
Yeah, student study
profile. So is that
Yeah.
something you would put together as a parent with, and then just kind of from year to year, like at the beginning of the year, you could give that to the new teacher or teachers and as a
Yes.
point of reference, because that seems like that would be super helpful.
Yes, and it's also something that, especially as they move levels, that would be great to share with the counselor or whoever the support person is going to be in the new building.
Okay.
We had students add to their student study form, and so they took tons of different. They can take on lots of different formats. So it can be done electronically, it can be a notebook, it can be, you name it. So I think it's just really up to you on how you want to do that.
Sounds like a really powerful tool. We had a question that someone sent in about how to keep this is our kind of greatest hits questions of how do
Yeah.
you keep the student involved and interested in class when they get bored because it's slow going. And I feel like you had a lot of stuff on there about focusing on strengths and challenges on, use on the thing areas where they're gifted. Do
Mhm.
you have anything to add to that in terms of what's the best way for a parent to try to help keep their student engaged?
So I'm a big believer in, and Terry, please kind of chime in because I know there are lots of pieces out there, but I'm a big believer in projects for our kids, um, mostly because it can be topic specific and kids can determine sort of an end product that they want to work towards. And so it allows you to kind of build something that they can work on when they're done in class with some of those other pieces. And this is where the collaboration comes into play, because you could actually take a look at an area in the day and ask if they could work on their project during that time, as opposed to doing some other work that maybe they're not very successful at right now. And it allows you to really flex how kids' needs are being met. But that's what I would really recommend. Projects, I think, are amazing for kids, and they can be done at school and at home.
Great. Um, we talked about this a little bit before everyone else started joining in, but um, I was wondering if anyone, Serena or Lynn or Terry, can speak to um, the 504 versus the IEP. And then another parent asked about the MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, and what those different strategies entail and what role they play when it's appropriate. And I know part of one question that I've heard is that some parents really ask, they want an IEP for their child to get some extra support within the school, but then there's a problem because they are told that the child doesn't really need an IEP because they're performing at grade level on reading for say, but for that student, for the parent's point of view, there's this discrepancy between their potential versus where they're actually performing. And so I wonder if anyone could speak to that. When is it appropriate to have a 504 versus an IEP versus some of these other strategies? Just jump in if you're.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, guys.
Um, well, I think part of it is we don't get to decide, that the school gets to decide that. But I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what qualifies for an IEP, what qualifies for a 504. A lot of focus ends up in the school system being on grades or, oh, they're average or they're doing fine. So that means they don't need an IEP. And that's not actually what IDEA legislation says. In fact, they've, released some clarification on that simply doing well in school doesn't mean that they don't qualify. So there are a lot of ways that the struggles that 2E students have can impact them educationally. And that's where IEP comes in. It's an individualized education program when they have unique needs that can't be, supported in other ways. And I don't work within the school system, so Serena, you'll have more information on that. But I think that is something that is important, is that often we parents get a lot of pushback with our 2E kids on whether they even need a 504 or even need any kind of supports, because they seem like they're doing fine. But there's, I always use the analogy of a swan or a duck gliding across the lake when underneath they're really having to work extra hard to do that. They may be doing fine, but it's taking them twice as long or 3 times as long. And then that significantly impacts their quality of life. So I really think that it's important to push for whatever supports that they need. That's really, I guess, a
So
general question.
what's a good way for a parent? It is confusing. I'm just learning a lot of this myself. And what would be a good way for a parent to try to find out what does qualify for, I mean, when is it appropriate to have an IEP versus when is it more appropriate to use a 504 or a different strategy?
I mean, yeah, go
I
ahead.
think for me, in the work that we do at our system, sorry, Terry,
No, you're fine.
one of the lenses that we look through is with a student who's on an IEP, they need specialized instruction compared to a student who is on a 504 who might primarily need accommodations to be able to access the educational environment. And that's a very like general answer, but I mean, like really it's looking at drilling down to what is the need, so that the gaps or whatever is impacting their experience at school with the disability, they can either access what's happening or they really need discrete specialized instruction. And then that would be more of the IEP route. But that's my broad answer because like I think Serena started, this is complex. All of these kids are very unique and very complex, and there's not one correct answer to any of these questions, really.
I think
Whatever you want.
the other part of this is that if you look at their scores through a variety of assessments, so that's the other part here. Whether or not they qualify for an IEP is one thing, but what's actually more important is seeing what assessments that your child can be given. And what you really need to think about is there's that whole, right, we know all about the bell curve, the distribution. If you have a child who is on both ends of the curve, not in the middle, right, where most people are, but they literally are, they've got pieces in both ends of the curve. That says a lot about your child being 2E. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a true thing for every child, but it definitely shows the split, the paradoxical split in who your child is. And often you're going to see kids with a processing speed that might be super low, and they're reading on grade level. And the question on the table is, this goes back to that sheet, the page that I showed you with some of those topics. Help me understand how we help so that she's not frustrated, she's not having meltdowns when she gets home, to deal with this. Does it mean that, what needs to be put in place? And then that can help, those data points can also help you with your IEP. Also why you need some kind of, you need to start collecting a way to track your child, to track the assessments, to track where they're falling on things, so that over time it builds, you have a much better picture for them. And so that's why that last slide I think was pretty important. Thanks, Joanne, for pointing that out.
I want to turn to another question about identification, but I was just wondering, ideally, schools would have unlimited resources and be able to do lots of assessments themselves, but we know that's not the reality of our school systems. So would you recommend that at some point for parents, like having an independent assessment, just in that the more information you have about, is there a processing disorder, that would be helpful? And kind of along the same line, somebody asked, if you have a child that's identified as gifted, but you're starting to suspect that maybe there might be something else going on, like you were just saying, Serena, with the two ends of the bell curve, maybe there's something else that seems off. When do you go and decide to seek a kind of an outside assessment for that student?
Lynn, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. I always say that, for families, there's a personal decision there if that's something they want to do. I get asked that question a lot, like especially with really little kids. And you know, when we go through our identification process in our system and we're looking at a student on the gifted side, and we're looking at a student who already is identified with a disability, we often, it's becoming more of our common practice, is we will have that student participate in our general group administered testing or our universal screening, but oftentimes the schools are connecting with us and we're really talking through what's the right tool to figure out if this student is identified as gifted, and so, or could be identified as gifted as well. And so typically, not all the time, but we make a kid by kid decision on partnering with that school and with our student support services or our special education department, and really looking at different tools to assess students, because often our universal screening tools and our group administered assessments miss kids. And it miss kids who are 2E. Not all the time, but it can. And so then we can take really more detailed data and work with the psychologists and the professionals and really kind of help understand the student. And so that's something that I think as a parent, you always need to advocate in that space with your child's school. But our schools and our department and our student support services department, we're very open to you know, understanding each learner and each 2E learner or gifted learner to make sure that we're providing what they need in the classroom. And so that may or may not have been some of your experiences. And if it isn't, or you're considering that, you know, start with your school about the gifted process, and then talk to them about, you know, connecting with the whole team. You know, my department there's only 2 of us for our whole system, but we do do a lot of partnering and consulting either with our mental health providers or our special ed teachers or with principals, so that we're at the table if we're not able to be physically there, so that we're part of that team. Sometimes we're physically there, but that's something that we really, you know, we want to make sure that we are finding the gifts in kids. I loved what you said, Serena, about the paradoxical characteristics, because that sounds like me on a broken record. You know, I mean, and sometimes when I do professional learning with teachers, it's about, we just say the flip side of the coin. Like there's that kid that talks all the time. Okay, well, what's the other side of the coin of talking all the time, right? And so, you know, I think we're open to that, and we want to be able to elevate that in kids and highlight that. And so we don't always just do, you know, I think people hear, oh, well, when are you going to do your COGAT testing? It's not always COGAT testing. It might be easier to call it that, but we really want to find the most information about kids that we can.
That was
I
another
don't know,
question.
I kept talking.
No,
sorry.
That was a question about what happens if you have a student who doesn't do well on the standard GT screens, gifted screening test. So it sounds like that there are other tools in place to try to identify. Just for parents who are wondering, since there's 2 sides of the coin, there's the students who have learning challenges who we're trying to see, you know, find the ones that are gifted. But then also the flip side for students who are already identified gifted, and a parent might suspect that they might be twice exceptional. Who at the school, like, what are the communication pathways? Where would you start in either situation? Like, would you start, if you are interested in seeing if your child is gifted, would you start with the GT coordinator at your school? Yeah. And then same thing for if you're wondering about twice exceptional.
So just to really quickly, the whole aspect of collaboration, this is why you need everybody at the table. And I think this is why it's important. If you start out piecemealing, then you're going to be missing, right? So if you only meet with the GT person, then the special ed person can't be there to begin to think about that dual differentiation. So if this is happening, you know, and they're gifted, why is this happening? And that's why you want to, this is how you advocate. You advocate by asking for everyone to be at the table. And the way that you collaborate is that you go in with as much as you can about your child and go in with the kinds of questions that you don't already have an answer to, but that you are legitimately going, this is what I'm concerned about for my child. What can we do? And if you have both special ed and gifted, and you have social emotional of some sort at the table, then you've got a team that's going to look at all of those components.
And I appreciate that you say that, Serena. And I think the collaboration is key. And I think it leads me to your other question, Joanne, is what she's just described is MTSS, right? MTSS is a framework that schools use in our district, across the state, across the country, in different places, where it's a framework where you're looking at levels of support and intervention for students. And so schools have collaborative teams where they talk about what kids' needs are and levels of intervention, and parents are a part of that process. And so you don't have to call it, I want to talk to your MTSS team, but you want to talk to the team and bring that, like Serena said, all to the table to talk about here and bring forth information about your kid, and so that the school everybody can be on the same page. Start with your classroom teacher and say, I want to have a meeting about my kiddo. I want to just keep working through all these things, and I want to invite all these other people and see what happens. We have structures to support that in our schools.
Is that, I personally don't know much about it, but for any other parents who aren't familiar, is that the MTSS, is that something where there's a meeting once a year, or a meeting whenever there's an issue, a meeting when, I mean, how does that work within the context of the school year?
That's
Is that a tricky question?
It is, because I think it works a little bit differently everywhere, but ideally it's always happening, right? Like that there's the multiple different teams that are talking about the needs of kids, whether it's in gray level bands or vertical bands or how schools set things up. But it should not be once a year we talk about kids, but it should be, as grade level teams are having collaborative dialogue looking at student work, and they're seeing trends and patterns in students. Maybe they bring some kids to the table to talk to a broader group about. I mean, it's something that's like this process that teachers engage in that planning time, and then when they're collaborating with their peers. And then some schools have very set, like, every Tuesday we're going to make sure that we're doing X, right? So it can look different. It can and should look different, and it can and does.
I know it's hard to speak in generalities when it's specific. So if there's a parent who is feeling like their student is struggling, whether it's something new or just a recurring issue, or if they feel like their student's not getting the support they need, is that where you would recommend, as Serena says, call for a meeting and ask for all of these people to be there to try to address the issue? Is that the best approach?
I mean, I'm always going to advocate to start with your child's teacher, right? Or their grade level team or their core team, and whatever, if they're an older student. And, we'll start, whether it starts with a phone call or an email, and say, let's have these days have a Zoom meeting and talk about it. I'd love to invite, someone from your social emotional team or one of the counselors or administrators to start the conversation going. And sometimes they start smaller and then a bigger group comes in. And that's where I think, to Serena's point, getting the principal in the room is really important, because the principal can find perhaps the right people in the table that you as the parent, or maybe even the teacher, are unsure of who might be the exact right person.
And we did have a question in the chat about if you're in a larger school, like a high school, whether to ask for the principal to be there, or whether to go with an assistant principal or a dean. And Lynn had a great answer to, you can always ask for an administrator to be present and let the principal decide whether that's who's the right administrator to be in on that meeting.
And in that situation, it could even be a counselor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Terry, do you have other stuff to add as far as parents advocating that way?
I mean, you guys obviously covered a lot. My thought as I was listening to you is that, you know, that's ideally the way things should work. And again, I'm coming at it as a parent, and I have a sophomore in high school and a senior in high school. So we've kind of like been through this whole thing, and being in private practice and having many, many parents come to us and really frustrated with their efforts to make that happen. And and obviously if they were at places where you guys were, it probably would happen. And I know because Lynn was the principal at my kids' elementary school when we were there a long time ago. So I know it happened like that, but I know it's not happening like that in a lot of places too. And that's where, I think that's often when people do end up seeking private evaluations. It's out of desperation and frustration and wanting to have information to take to the school to say there really is something going on. Either they really are gifted and you guys don't see it, or they really do have some other issue that's getting in their way, some other difference. And so I think that's a reality out there too. I guess I just wanted to say that. And that, on our end, we do usually see people who are frustrated. So because they've tried all of those things and they haven't felt like they've worked. So we always, and often after we do a private evaluation, we will tell people, make the request in writing, that, in an email, because, we'll say, well, we asked for this, or we said we wanted help. And it's like, well, you do it in writing so that, and that's my big recommendation is when you make a request, even if it's just like, hey, teacher, hey, team, can we meet? Can we talk about my kid? Send an email to everybody so you can say, hey, I sent this email and it didn't happen, or I asked for these and the teacher talked, or whatever it is. So I have that other perspective of dealing with lots of parents who have tried all of those things and they didn't work. So, and that's unfortunate, really, because we have them, when we're talking about 2E kids, especially, we have that masking effect. Like they mask the giftedness, masks the differences, and the differences mask the giftedness. And it's, and it's hard sometimes to figure out what's going on. So
that advocacy, I keep hearing that. Every time I hear a speaker on 2E, it's just advocate. It gets exhausting sometimes, but you can't stop. So I appreciate that tip of getting things in writing, because I think that's helpful for parents who are struggling a little bit to break through. I wanted to point out before I forget, because I meant to point this out earlier. Terry had a list of resources about Twice Exceptional. And if you go all the way up to the top of the chat, there's a link and we will post it. And you can take a look. I'm gonna see if I can share it real quick.
I just dropped it back in.
You dropped it back in. Okay. So go ahead and if you want to take a look at that, there's some good books and websites. I know Serena said there was a newsletter on there that's helpful. Like I said, if you don't get it in the chat, we will post it when we post the recording of this talk. We had a couple other just general questions from parents. And one was on executive functioning. So I know executive functioning is something that a lot of us struggle with, but especially some 2E kiddos. Do you guys have any resources that you'd recommend for helping a middle schooler develop executive functioning skills, especially real life skills, for doing things out in the, at home or even homework? They said that their student is really good at kind of the academic abstract problem solving, but not necessarily, getting ready to go on time or getting their homework done. So do you have any favorite resources for executive functioning?
I can't remember if I put any on the resource, but several. Sarah Ward's work is amazing. So I think her website is executive function, efpractice.com. She's got some great resources. Seth Perler is based out of Boulder. He's got some great resources, a lot of free resources. He does a vlog and things like that. And then Smart But Scattered, I think, is a really great, there's a Smart But Scattered Teens. And that is Peg Dawson and Richard Guare. They have, it's just really practical. All of those are all really practical. And then, and what I always tell people is executive function are skills. They're skills that they have to practice, and they have to practice them consistently. And you don't go from here to here with executive functions. You go from here to like here, and you look for little tiny increments. And yay, you woke up 10 minutes before your class started today. That's great. Or I didn't have to come in and turn the light on, and you woke up yourself. But it's hard. You don't expect to be in great shape just going to the gym once. You have to go to the gym over and over and practice it and tweak it, and those skills. And that's the good thing about them, is that they're skills. The bad thing is that they're skills that you have to practice. So yeah, those are our 3 favorite resources that we recommend.
Yeah, those are great ones. And I think even someone from your team, Terry, came out 2 years ago and did executive functioning training for our coordinators at our schools, as well as for families. And so that's certainly something that, we can bring back to our community. It's something we work with our teachers on in our classrooms. Because I think the other space for me that I found in my role and as a parent is, as a parent, you can also talk out loud about what you're doing in that executive function space, because kids don't always see what they did when years ago, like we make a phone call, you have to call this person, you do this, we're all multitasking, everything's hidden on our computers and our screens. But if you articulate, okay, I have to go to the grocery store and I have to make my list and I have to get these things, and it feels really silly to talk out loud sometimes, but that's just bringing awareness to the actual skills and steps that you're doing to be organized, or to get somewhere on time, or to talk about your mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I put in the chat the link to Conversations with CAGT has the recorded talks, and Seth Perler did a talk, and there was another one recently that I'm forgetting the name now, but they had some good tips for developing executive function skills. Okay, we still have a couple questions that were sent in advance, and then also some in the chat. Any tips for the summer months to keep students off the screens and engaged? If there is a magic answer, I'd like to have it.
Talking post-COVID or during COVID?
I think for this summer, the question was specifically,
Yeah.
but yeah, hopefully we can get out and be outside with people a little bit more this summer.
Mm-hmm.
I know, Serena, you were talking about the projects in the classroom and in the schools, and I feel like you could do that over the summer at home too. I know with my kids, I've started asking them, when you're in school, if you have a wondering or a question that comes up while you're listening to the teacher talk, write it down on a slip of paper or send it to me in an email or whatever works for you. And let's do some projects at home to try to let you delve deeper into those. So that might be one way.
There's a family, and I like this idea a ton. So at the beginning of the summer, they each put in, each child put in 10 things they wanted to do over the summer. And then every few days, week, whatever, they would pull it out of the hat. And so it kept things sort of new and different, and they would just do whatever that activity was. So if it was like a picnic, or I want to go to the zoo, or whatever it might be, that was a way for this parent to keep her kids engaged in things. And she said she wasn't always having to brainstorm things to do. And the kids generated them, so they tolerated what their siblings wanted to do. So
That's
just
cool.
something for thought.
Yeah.
That's like the magic question, right?
Right.
We'd all be zillionaires if we knew that one.
There is a question in the chat about how do the tests decide how students are gifted? Is it based on a grade level or an age level? I don't know if Lynn, if you can speak to that. Like, what do they actually use to decide if they're gifted?
Well, we use more than just one test. So it's not just one thing. And so there doesn't need to be this test prep anxiety or my kid do perfectly. But we use age-based norms for students, not grade level, but where they are as age. And so when we're comparing them to students of their same age in that nationally normed those assessments. And so
Same with.
but then we
504
also
QS, yeah.
yeah.
Because I know we definitely have, even within a grade, there's a big age spread with students starting a little early versus waiting a year to start kindergarten. So, and then I think one last question, and then I want to try to end on time. So we'll go through the last question or two and then wrap it up. We have a question about talking about the collaboration teams. The question is, if your child is seeing a psychologist and the psychologist is communicating with the school counselor, then is the counselor sufficient to have in that team meeting when you're talking about the pathway forward, or should you invite the psychologist to participate?
So here's where this becomes very much school-based, to Lynn's point. So depending on the kinds of resources that you have in your building, that'll probably drive how you move forward. So really that one is school-based. And so what I would do is talk to the counselor about what are the best next steps to move forward, because this indicates to me that you already know that you're thinking IEP or 504. Therefore, you probably know that they would know who you want to put in the room. When I'm talking about collaborating, I'm actually talking about after a lot of these pieces are in place, so that everybody's together to talk about the best way to build a plan, so that you can dual differentiate together and not in an isolate. So that's just how I would look at that.
Okay.
I'd be with you there, Serena, as well. I mean, it's really going to be school dependent and kid dependent, right? Like, is it sufficient? I don't know, right? Like, because if you're still in a space where you're not in an agreement of what can work, maybe not. But I really think, to your point about collaborating, as a team ongoing, because really, I think the space that I see where I'm called in to consult with teams most often is really supporting that strengths get addressed first, because we all want to fix, right? And sometimes in that space of fix, we don't always address the strength. And so we really, that partnership is so important so that dual differentiation can happen, and that the strengths are addressed, and that the strengths aren't earned behaviors, but they are just part of who that student is, and that they get to engage in that to support who they are as a learner and to excel. So.
I had one last question that wasn't related to anything else that someone sent in, so I have it here at the end. Someone wanted to know if any of you have resources for if you have a child dealing with Tourette's, specific for Tourette syndrome. I don't know if you don't have any off the top of your head, I can always, if you think of something later and send it, I can get it back to the person. But
Yeah, I saw that in advance. I mean, the thing with Tourette's is that which is tics, you know, is that in and of itself, it's often, you know, a matter of being embracing and supporting and just having an environment where that's just, I mean, it's part of neurodiversity. It's part of who your kid is if they have tics. So in and of itself, sometimes Tourette's, there's no specific treatment unless it starts to really impact functioning. So, but Tourette's can also co-occur with other things. So that would be, I mean, it's hard to answer that question with just like, how do you support Tourette's without knowing the bigger picture? Because I think that there often isn't, it's like, it's helpful to know if Tourette's is something that somebody has, but it's really a matter of like, if you have tics, like I have a nephew who has tics and it's just like, that's just him, you know, but it can co-occur. They can have ADHD, they can have learning struggles. So I guess I would need to know more about, you know, how it was impacting functioning, because that's always when you think about interventions, is how is something impacting functioning. If it's not impacting functioning, even like ADHD, you don't always need medication for ADHD. You don't always need supports until it starts impacting functioning. So I'm seeing more.
Someone had put in the chat that Tourette's is a 12-year PE boy, ADHD, and written expression. I don't know if that gives you any more information, or if it's still, it gets into that, what we were saying about the complexity.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you know, 2E is such a, it's not usually 2, it's usually multi exceptional. So it's gifted and neurodiversity, you know, and that neurodiversity can often be multifaceted. So supporting any one aspect of it, the giftedness, Tourette's, the ADHD, all of that is, you know, doing a 360 of what are all of the supports that need to be in place. So
the parent is asking, where do you try to support, you know, if you have all those multiple things, how do you decide where to focus first? Or is it, you really have to look at the whole picture together?
I
don't know.
if anyone else wants to say that, but I mean, we get lots of complicated cases that that we assess, and you know, you don't want to come at a kid with like, hey, you've got this and this and this and this, and you know, you don't want to spend all the time in their deficits and in their struggles, but what is impacting functioning? So again, I just go like, what are the things that are impacting, what's getting in their way the most? And so like if attention and focus and things like that are getting in their way the most, then we want to maybe put most of our effort towards that and also spend time in their strengths. So I think that's the way I think about it, is look at the big picture. What are all of the things going, what are all the facets and what's impacting functioning? Where does it seem like the supports need to come from? So
that makes sense. Thank you. Well, we are out of time, and I think we actually got through all the questions. So I just want to say a big thank you to Serena and Lynn and Terry, all for coming and sharing this with us. I think it was helpful and a good place to get some answers to questions, or maybe even just a place to start as you're seeking more answers. Again, I will be posting this recording of this talk on our website, and also Terry's list of resources. And then Serena, I had a couple people ask if I could post the slides. So if that's okay with you, if you send me the slides, I will post them as well, so people can get some of those good. You had a lot of good ones with the strategies and the different characteristics. So
Sounds
with
good.
that, Thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone has a great
Night,
evening
everybody.
and stays warm.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you very much.